The venue was sleek and softly lit that evening. Cool music drifted quietly through the air. Glasses clinked at distant tables. Conversations moved in low, measured tones, the way conversations move in rooms where powerful people have learned that composure is its own kind of currency. At the center table sat a man named Celeb Harrington, age 38. His dark hair was neatly set. His jaw carried the easy confidence of someone who had spent years being watched and had long since made peace with it. Beside him sat an older man named Darius Steele, age 40. Darius wore a navy suit and a calm smile. He looked settled, authoritative, the kind of man who always seemed to know something the room did not. He had been Caleb's manager and closest friend for over a decade. A leather folder rested on the table between them. Inside it, a contract worth $10 million. Caleb believed tonight would be the moment that changed the entire next chapter of his life. Standing near the far edge of the room was a young woman named Mia Fontaine, age 27. She was not on the guest list. Her brown hair fell slightly across her face. Her hands were pressed together at her chest, fingers laced tightly around a folded tissue. Her eyes were red. Her breathing was unsteady. She had been standing there for several minutes, watching, waiting, gathering something that looked very much like courage. Darius leaned closer to Caleb. His voice dropped slightly as he walked him through the final terms: the partnership structure, the brand commitments, the payout timeline. Caleb listened carefully. Darius spoke with the smooth confidence of a man who had handled rooms like this 100 times. He said the investors were satisfied. He said the terms were the best available. He said hesitation at this stage could signal weakness and cost Caleb everything he had worked toward. Caleb looked down at the contract again. At 38, a man begins to understand something important. That success arrives not in one large wave but in a long series of quiet sacrifices. He thought about the years behind him. The early mornings rehearsing in a car park. The years of rejection before the first break. The night his father told him to get a real job and he had driven home in silence and decided, somewhere between the highway and his front door, that he would rather fail loudly than surrender quietly. He had built everything from that decision. And tonight, that everything was about to be rewarded. Darius placed one hand gently on the folder. "The pen is ready," he said. Caleb nodded slowly. Mia stood at the edge of the room, still watching. She watched Darius speak. She watched Caleb listen. Something inside her chest tightened with every word. She had been a fan of Caleb Harrington for 9 years. Long enough to have followed every interview, every comeback, every quiet detail the public overlooked. But what she had heard the previous night had nothing to do with being a fan. It had to do with something far simpler and far more serious. She had heard the truth. And the truth was not in that folder. The pen touched the first page. Mia stepped forward. The night Caleb Harrington arrived at the Meridian Grand, the city felt like it was holding its breath. Black cars lined the private entrance. Men in earpieces stood at every door. Inside, the venue hummed with the kind of controlled electricity that only appears when serious money is about to change hands. Staff moved in crisp, practiced lines. The lighting was deliberately low, warm gold against dark walls, the kind of atmosphere that made every decision feel historic and every signature feel permanent. Caleb stepped out of the car and the night air hit him like a reminder. This was real. After 18 years in the industry, after the lean years, the stolen credits, the contracts that took more than they gave, tonight was the night the scale finally tipped in his favor. $10 million. A global brand partnership that would carry his name beyond music, beyond tours, beyond the noise of an industry that had chewed through better men than him and never once apologized. His team moved around him the way they always did. Publicist on his left, legal advisor 3 steps behind, 2 assistants orbiting at a respectful distance. The whole machinery of his success, moving in quiet formation. And at the center of it all, steady as a heartbeat, was Darius. Darius Steele walked beside him with both hands relaxed at his sides, the leather folder tucked under one arm, his navy suit immaculate. He had been there for all of it, the first manager who ever believed the numbers, the friend who answered calls at 2 in the morning, the man who knew Caleb's career better than Caleb sometimes knew it himself. If Caleb was the name on the billboard, Darius was the foundation it was built on. "How do you feel?" Darius asked quietly as they walked the corridor toward the signing suite. Caleb exhaled slowly. "Like I've been waiting my whole life for this room," he said. Darius smiled. "Good," he said. "Because it's yours." The doors to the suite opened. The investors rose from their seats. Hands were shaken. The folder was placed on the table. Caleb looked down at the contract. Pages of figures and clauses and a signature line at the bottom with his name already printed beneath it. He reached for the pen. And that was the exact moment the door behind him opened, and a woman's voice, cracked and trembling, broke through the silence of the most important room he had ever stood in. "Caleb, please, don't sign that." Mia Fontaine had rehearsed this moment 47 times in the corridor outside. She knew the number because she had counted. It was the kind of thing a person does when their hands won't stop shaking and their mind needs something. Anything to hold on to besides the terror of what they are about to do. She was not supposed to be here. She knew that. The guest list at the Meridian Grand that evening held the names of investors, lawyers, publicists, and industry figures who had spent decades earning their seat in rooms like this one. Mia's name was not among them. She was a 27-year-old junior events coordinator who had recognized Caleb Harrington's voice drifting through a hotel corridor the previous evening and had stopped, purely by instinct, outside a half-open door. She wished she hadn't. And she was desperately glad she had. She had heard everything. Darius's voice, loose and confident the way a man sounds when he believes no one important is listening, describing the hidden commission structure, laughing quietly at how cleanly the clauses were buried, telling the investors that Caleb trusted him completely and that trust was, in his own words, the most useful thing about him. Mia had stood frozen in that corridor for a full minute before her hands found her phone and pressed record. Too late to capture the worst of it. But not too late to capture enough. Now she stood outside the second door with that recording burning in her pocket like something alive, replaying the 38 seconds of audio she had managed to save. Darius's voice, unmistakable, unhurried, damning. She had listened to it so many times the words had stopped sounding real. But they were real. She knew they were real. She also knew what she looked like. She had caught her reflection in a corridor window. Red eyes, damp cheeks, the expression of a woman on the edge of something she could not come back from. She looked like exactly what Darius would call her. A fan. Unstable. A problem to be managed. Her thumb hovered over her phone screen one final time. 38 seconds. That was all she had. 38 seconds against 10 years of friendship, $10 million, and a room full of people who had never once needed to be believed by anyone. She pushed the door open. The pen was already in Caleb's hand. Darius saw her before anyone else did. That was the first thing that should have meant something. Not the investors, not the legal team, not the two assistants standing closest to the door. Darius. The man whose back was partially turned. The man mid-sentence in a conversation with the lead investor. He saw Mia Fontaine step through that door and his entire body responded in the same fraction of a second. A barely visible stillness, a micro-shift in the jaw, a smile that stayed on his face but quietly left his eyes. He raised 2 fingers toward the security officer near the wall. A signal so small, so practiced, that nobody in the room caught it. Nobody except Mia. She saw his hand move and she understood immediately what it meant. Her window was closing. Whatever she had come here to do, she had seconds, not minutes, to do it. Caleb turned around slowly, drawn by the sudden shift in the room's energy. He saw her standing near the doorway. Brown hair, red eyes, trembling hands pressed together at her chest, a tissue crushed between her fingers. She looked devastated. She looked terrified. She looked like someone who had spent everything they had just getting through that door. Darius was already moving toward Caleb's side, his voice low and calm and perfectly measured. "I'm sorry about this," he said quietly. "She's been sending letters to the label for months. The team flagged her as a concern back in the spring. She's not well, Caleb. Security will handle it." Caleb said nothing. He looked at Mia across the room. She was crying openly now, her eyes locked on his with an expression that had nothing to do with obsession and everything to do with desperation. The kind of desperation that does not perform. The kind that simply exists, raw and unguarded, in front of anyone willing to look closely enough. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. He glanced at the contract on the table, then back at her. The pen was still in his hand. The security officer touched Mia's arm. And Caleb, slowly, almost, began to turn back toward the table. "Wait," Mia said. Her voice cracked clean in half on that single word. And something in it made Caleb stop. 5 seconds was all she got. The security officer's grip tightened on her arm and the room began to tilt back toward normal. Toward the contract, toward the pen, toward the $10 million machinery that had been set in motion long before Mia Fontaine had ever walked through that door. She felt herself being guided backward, firmly, professionally, the way people are removed from important rooms every day without anyone remembering their name by morning. So she used the 5 seconds. "Caleb." Her voice came out louder than she expected, louder than she had managed in the corridor during any of her 47 rehearsals. It cut through the room with a clarity that stopped 3 separate conversations mid-sentence. "He lied to my face. I heard him. I have proof." The room did not just go quiet. It went still, the specific weighted stillness of a space where everyone has simultaneously decided not to be the first person to move or speak or breathe too loudly. Darius laughed. It was a good laugh, warm, slightly exasperated, the laugh of a reasonable man encountering something unreasonable. But Mia watched his jaw, and his jaw told a completely different story. It was tight, locked. The laugh lived only above the neck. Across the table, the lead investor turned his head toward his colleague by exactly 3 degrees. It was not a look of confusion. It was a look of calculation. The kind exchanged between people who have already discussed the possibility of exactly this moment and are now quietly determining whether their contingency still holds. Caleb had not moved. He stood with the pen still in his hand, his back half turned, his eyes on Mia with an expression that was impossible to read from the outside and devastating to be on the receiving end of. He was not dismissing her. He was not reassuring her. He was simply looking. The way a man looks when something underneath a familiar surface has just shifted and he is deciding, in real time, whether to acknowledge it or walk away. Darius stepped forward. "Caleb, the investors have a flight at." Caleb raised one hand. Just one hand. Quietly. The way a man stops traffic not through force but through absolute certainty that the traffic will stop. The room obeyed. "Let her speak," he said. Darius went very still. And in that stillness, for the first time all evening, something close to fear moved briefly across his face. Mia's fingers found her phone. They were shaking so badly she nearly dropped it twice. The recording was in there. 38 seconds. Everything she had. She just had to find it before Darius found his voice again. Her thumb was trembling so badly she opened the wrong app twice. The room watched her. Every second she spent searching felt like a year. She could feel the weight of 14 sets of eyes, could feel Darius somewhere to her left, perfectly still, perfectly silent, in the way that a pressure system is silent before it breaks. She did not look at him. She could not afford to look at him. She kept her eyes on the screen and scrolled and found the file and pressed play before her courage could negotiate a different outcome. The sound that came out of that phone rewired the entire room. Darius Steele's voice. Unhurried. Comfortable. The voice of a man in a private moment who has fully forgotten that private moments can be stolen. The beauty of it is the layering. By the time his legal team finds the commission structure, it's already executed. Clause 9 references Clause 22, which loops back through the licensing amendment. Nobody reads that far. Especially not talent. A pause. Then quiet laughter. "He trusts me completely. Has done for 10 years. That's not arrogance. That's just the most useful thing about him." 38 seconds of audio. But it was those 14 that mattered. Those 14 that landed in the center of the room like something dropped from a great height. Not loud, not explosive, but carrying the kind of weight that rearranges everything it touches. Nobody moved. The lead investor had stopped breathing visibly. His colleague had placed both hands flat on the table. The unconscious gesture of a man bracing. The legal advisor to Caleb's left had taken a single step backward as though the table itself had become dangerous. And Caleb. Caleb stood with the pen still in his hand and his eyes fixed on a point slightly above the phone, the way a person stares when they are not seeing the room anymore but something further back. A decade of mornings, 1,000 conversations, every moment they had ever chosen trust over doubt and called it friendship. The recording ended. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, packed tightly with every unasked question, every unseen clause, every phone call Caleb had never been on. He turned his head slowly toward Darius. And Darius, for the first time in 10 years, had absolutely nothing to say. Caleb looked at Darius for a long time. Not with anger. That would have been easier for both of them. Anger has edges you can grab onto, words you can throw, a shape that at least makes sense of the pain beneath it. What was on Caleb's face was far quieter and far more final than anger. It was the expression of a man watching something he had built with his own hands, something he had staked years of trust and sacrifice upon, fold silently inward, the way a structure collapses not from explosion but from the slow, invisible failure of a single load-bearing wall. He did not speak. He did not need to. Darius opened his mouth. The room waited. 10 years of friendship, 10 years of shared history, 10 years of two in the morning phone calls and handshake decisions, and I've got you, Caleb, I've always got you. All of it compressed into whatever Darius was about to say. He closed his mouth. Because there was nothing. Not a defense, not a reframing, not even the performance of innocence. The recording had taken all of that away with 14 seconds of his own voice, relaxed and damning and completely unaware that it would one day play in the most important room of his career. At the far end of the table, the lead investor reached for his briefcase with the careful, unhurried movement of a man who has survived many rooms by knowing precisely when to leave one. His colleague followed. Papers were gathered. Jackets were straightened. Nobody made eye contact. The elegant machinery of the deal, weeks of preparation, thousands in venue costs, a contract assembled by 4 senior lawyers, dismantled itself in under 90 seconds without a single confrontational word. Caleb looked down at the contract. He picked it up with both hands, looked at it for one long moment, at his name printed at the bottom, at the signature line waiting beneath it like an open grave. Then he folded it once, cleanly, along the center, and placed it back on the table. Not thrown. Not torn. Placed. With the quiet precision of a man who understands that the most powerful statements rarely require volume. The pen rolled slightly on the table and stopped. Darius was still standing there. Still silent. Still searching for something. A word, an exit, a version of this moment that didn't end his career along with his conscience. Then Caleb did something nobody in the room expected. He turned away from Darius entirely and walked toward Mia. Mia had not moved from the spot where she had pressed play. She was still standing near the doorway, still trembling, still clutching the phone in both hands, still wearing the expression of someone braced for the impact of a verdict that had not yet fully arrived. Her eyes were red and her breathing was uneven, and some part of her was still waiting, even now, for the room to turn against her. For someone to say she had misunderstood. For Darius to produce a counter-explanation so smooth and so reasonable that everyone would nod and the pen would return to Caleb's hand, and she would be escorted out into the night with nothing but the memory of having tried. Caleb walked toward her and the room watched him do it. Every step he took across that floor was a sentence. A declaration delivered not in words but in direction. In the simple, irreversible act of choosing which way to face when everything around you is collapsing. He walked past the table. Past the folded contract. Past the investors who were no longer investors and the lawyers who were already calculating their next moves. Past 10 years of a story he had believed completely and would now have to learn how to grieve. He stopped in front of her. Mia looked up at him. Up close, she could see that he was not untouched. There was something behind his eyes, careful, tightly held, that told her the stillness he was carrying had cost him something enormous to maintain. He was not made of stone. He was made of the same breakable material as everyone else. He was simply choosing, with tremendous deliberate effort, not to break here. Not in this room. Not in front of these people. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. Quietly. Looking directly at her. Not through her, not past her, but at her, the way people look when they mean to be seen looking. Mia pressed her lips together and nodded once because she did not trust her voice with anything more than that. Then Caleb turned and walked toward the exit. Alone. No team, no Darius, no folder, no script. The doors opened and the night air entered briefly. Cool and indifferent and vast, and then the doors closed behind him and he was gone. Outside, the city moved the way cities always move, without pausing, without ceremony, without the faintest acknowledgement that something irreversible had just occurred inside one of its glittering rooms. Caleb stood on the steps of the Meridian Grand and breathed. No contract. No Darius. No carefully managed version of his own life handed back to him in $10 million increments by someone he had trusted with the parts of himself that never made the interviews. For the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, nobody was telling him what came next. It should have felt like ruin. It felt like the first honest moment he'd had in years. He reached into his jacket pocket. His phone showed 14 missed calls from his publicist, 3 from his lawyer, and 1 from a number he didn't recognize. He put the phone away without answering any of them. Then, from somewhere behind him, through the slowly closing doors, he heard Darius's voice rise for the first time all evening. No longer calm. No longer controlled. Something had finally cracked through the surface, and what came out was urgent and unraveling and too late. Caleb did not turn around. He walked down the steps and into the city and did not look back once, because some doors, when you walk through them, are only ever meant to go one way.